The wind had teeth, and it was biting at Eli Danner's bones. It howled across the high plains of Wyoming, a desolate cry that scraped the last of the autumn leaves from the cottonwoods and promised a winter that would kill anything not strong enough to endure it. Gray clouds, the color of old iron, hung low and heavy, smothering the light from the sky. Eli pulled the brim of his worn hat down, tucking his chin into the collar of his sheepskin coat. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Gideon, plodded onward, its breath pluming in the frigid air. Each step was a weary effort on the frozen, rutted trail. For 3 days, Eli had seen nothing but the endless expanse of frosted sagebrush and distant, snow-dusted mountains. He was a man adrift, seeking not so much a destination as a temporary halt to the ceaseless motion that had defined his life for the past 5 years. Work was an excuse. Rest was a lie, he told himself. What he truly sought was a quiet place where the ghosts that rode with him might finally grow tired and fall behind. But they were relentless, their whispers tangled in the sound of the wind. He reached the town of Redemption just as the first flurries of snow began to drift from the sky. It was hardly a town, more a collection of weathered buildings huddled together against the vast emptiness, a testament to the stubbornness of the men and women who had hammered it into existence. There was a saloon, a livery stable, a general store, and a church whose steeple looked like a lonely finger pointing at a god who had long since looked away. Eli swung down from Gideon, his legs stiff with cold. He tied the reins to a hitching post outside the general store, the wood so cold it felt sticky to the touch. Inside, the air was warm and thick with the scent of coffee, cured tobacco, and oiled leather. A pot-bellied stove in the center of the room radiated a comforting heat. 2 men were talking to the storekeeper, their voices a low rumble. "Heard from Jebediah Thorne lately?" one of the men asked. A rancher with a face creased like old parchment. The storekeeper, a stout man polishing a jar of preserves, shook his head. "Not in months. Used to be he'd come in for whiskey and salt, regular as clockwork. Now, nothing. Sends that girl of his sometimes, the stepdaughter, but not even her. Not for a while now." "The quiet one?" the rancher grunted. "Always looks like a spooked doe. My Martha says the girl is touched, not right in the head." "Can't blame her," the storekeeper said, his voice dropping. "Living out there alone with a man like Thorne, since her mother passed. He ain't been right since the drink took him for good. Sad thing, the girl is pretty enough in a plain sort of way, but strange. They say she just reads her Bible and talks to the walls." Eli moved toward the back of the store, pretending to inspect a display of canned beans. He did not want to be a part of their conversation, but the words snagged in his mind. A drunk rancher, a weird girl, alone. It was a familiar story in this hard country, a tale that often ended in sorrow. He bought a small sack of coffee and some hardtack, paid the storekeeper in coin, and left without a word. The men's whispers followed him out into the cold. Back on the trail, the snow was falling faster, the flakes thicker and heavier. The words of the townsman echoed in his head, stirring the silt of his own bitter memories. He squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, but the darkness behind his eyelids offered no peace. Instead, he saw it again. A flash of splintered images that never left him. A woman's face, her mouth open in a scream that he could no longer hear but could always feel. A vibration deep in his soul. The bright, ugly flash of gunfire in a darkened room. The raw, black earth of a freshly dug grave, marked only by a crude wooden cross with no name carved upon it. He had built that cross with his own 2 hands. His knuckles, wrapped around the leather reins, were white. He was a man haunted by a failure he could never outrun. He had tried to protect someone once, someone innocent and good, and the law had done nothing. The world had done nothing. So he had left it all behind. The small plot of land, the half-built home, the trust he once had in other men. He had become a drifter, a shadow moving from one place to the next, carrying a cold, hard knot of rage in his chest that he mistook for a heart. The wind picked up, driving the snow into a blinding sheet of white. The trail disappeared. Gideon whinnied, nervous, turning his head against the punishing gusts. Eli was lost. The world had been erased, swallowed by the storm. He knew that to stop moving was to die. He gave the horse its head, trusting the animal's instinct to find shelter. Any shelter. For hours they pushed through the blizzard, the cold seeping through Eli's coat, numbing his fingers and toes. Dusk was falling, turning the white landscape into a terrifying expanse of gray and black. Hope was a dying ember. Then he saw it, a flicker, a small, weak spark of orange light. A quarter-mile to the south, barely visible through the swirling snow. It was a candle, or a fire. Seen through a window, it was life, with the last of his strength. He urged Gideon toward it, the horse stumbling through drifts that were now knee-deep. He found a small cabin, barely more than a shack, with a lean-to stable attached. It was hunkered down against a sparse line of pine trees, looking as if the wind might tear it apart at any moment. Smoke curled weakly from its stone chimney. He dismounted, his body aching, and led Gideon into the relative shelter of the lean-to. There was no other horse, only a pile of hay and the scent of old manure. He pulled the saddle off, rubbed the horse down as best he could, and then made his way to the cabin door. He knocked, his frozen knuckles making a dull thud against the wood. For a long moment, there was no answer. He could hear the storm raging around him, and he wondered if the person inside had even heard him. He knocked again, harder this time. "Hello? Anyone in there? Caught in the storm." The bolt on the inside of the door scraped back with a hesitant sound. The door opened a crack, and a young woman peered out. Her eyes, wide and the color of a winter sky, were filled with a stark animal fear. But behind the fear, there was a stillness, a strange calm that seemed out of place. She was thin, her face pale and drawn, framed by simple brown hair pulled back in a severe braid. She wore a patched but clean homespun dress. This had to be her, the weird girl, Clara. "Please, ma'am," Eli said, his voice rough with cold. "My horse and I, we can't go on. Just a place to wait out the storm. I'll sleep on the floor. I mean no harm." She looked at him, her gaze sweeping over his snow-caked coat, his tired face, the gun holstered at his hip. He saw her hesitate, her hand trembling on the edge of the door. He expected her to slam it shut, to leave him to the mercy of the blizzard. It was what a sensible woman would do. But instead, after a long, silent moment, she pulled the door open wider. "Come in," she whispered, her voice so soft it was almost lost in the wind. He stepped inside, bringing a blast of cold air with him. She shut the door quickly and slid the heavy wooden bar back into place. The sound echoed in the small room. The cabin was spare, almost barren. A single room served as kitchen, parlor, and bedroom. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a small fire crackling within it, providing the only real warmth and light. Dried herbs, sage, yarrow, and others he did not recognize, hung from the low rafters, filling the air with a faint, medicinal scent. A small, rough-hewn table with 2 chairs stood in the center of the room. On it lay a thick, leather-bound Bible, its pages worn and softened with use. In the corner was a simple cot, neatly made. "My stepfather, he's away," the girl, Clara, said, not looking at him. She spoke to the floorboards. "Dealing with cattle up in the high country, the storm, he might not be back for days." Eli nodded, unbuttoning his coat. He sensed a lie in her words, or at least a carefully constructed truth meant to reassure him or herself. Drunk ranchers did not go to the high country in the first snows of winter. He did not press her. It was not his place. "Thank you, ma'am. I'm grateful." "There is stew," she offered. gesturing toward a pot simmering over the fire. "It isn't much." "It's more than I had," he said. They ate in a thick, unnerving silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the howling of the wind outside. The stew was thin, mostly potatoes and a few bits of salted pork, but it was hot, and it chased some of the deep cold from his body. Clara sat opposite him, her head bowed, her eyes fixed on her bowl. She moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, but her stillness was tense, like a wire pulled taut. She seemed to shrink into herself, trying to take up as little space as possible. Eli watched her over the rim of his spoon. She was younger than he had first thought, maybe not yet 20. There was a fragility about her, but also an unnerving self-possession. It was the calm of someone who has endured so much that nothing could truly surprise them anymore. As she reached for the water pitcher, the frayed cuff of her sleeve slid back, revealing the delicate skin of her wrist. For a fleeting second, he saw it. A series of faint, discolored marks, purplish blue and yellow, like the fading memory of a man's fingers wrapped too tight. She saw him look. Her hand jerked back as if she had been burned, and she quickly pulled her sleeve down, hiding the evidence. Her gaze flickered up to his, just for a second, and in her eyes, he saw a flash of pure terror, followed by a wave of deep, profound shame. Then she looked away again, her pale cheeks flushed. Eli said nothing. He simply lowered his own gaze back to his bowl, but the image of those bruises was seared into his mind. The town gossip was not just gossip. The knot of cold rage in his chest tightened. When they were finished eating, she cleared the wooden bowls, washing them in a basin with a quiet efficiency that suggested years of lonely routine. Eli took off his boots and wet outer clothes, laying them near the hearth to dry. She did not offer him the cot, and he did not expect her to. She gestured to a pile of folded blankets and a thin straw mat near the door. "You can sleep there," she said softly. "It's fine, thank you," he replied. He spread the mat and blankets out, his back to the wall, his gun belt coiled beside him. From this spot, he could see the entire room, the door, the window, the fire, and her. He lay down, pulling a single blanket over himself, and closed his eyes, feigning sleep. The cabin grew quiet. The storm outside seemed to intensify, rattling the wooden shutters and shrieking under the eaves. After a long while, he heard her move, through slitted eyelids. He watched as Clara knelt on the stone hearth, facing the fire. The flames cast dancing shadows across her face, highlighting the sharp lines of her cheekbones and the hollows beneath her eyes. She did not make a sound. She clasped her hands together so tightly that her knuckles went white, bowed her head, and began to pray. Her lips moved, forming silent words of supplication or confession. She stayed like that for what felt like an hour, a solitary, devout figure locked in a silent conversation with her God. Eli watched, a strange ache in his chest. He saw not a weird girl, but a prisoner in her own home, seeking solace from the only source she had left. He wondered what she prayed for: escape, forgiveness, for her stepfather to never return. He lay there, a stranger guarding the door, and felt the weight of his own unanswered prayers pressed down upon him. He must have drifted off, because the next thing he knew, a pale, gray light was filtering through the cracks in the shutters. The wind had died down. The silence was absolute, a heavy, muffling quiet that only a deep snow can bring. He sat up, his joints stiff. The fire had burned down to glowing orange embers. Clara was already awake, sitting at the table, her Bible open before her. She was not reading it, just staring at the page, lost in thought. She looked up when he moved, her expression unreadable. He stood and walked to the door. Lifting the heavy bar, he pushed it open a few inches and looked out. The world was gone. Everything, the trail, the trees, the horizon, had been buried under a thick, pristine blanket of white. Snow was piled in a massive drift against the cabin. Reaching halfway up the door, there was no leaving. Not today, and likely not tomorrow. He closed the door and turned to face her. Her gaze met his across the small room. Neither of them spoke of it. They did not need to. The silence of the morning, the wall of white outside, the shared space of the tiny cabin. It was all the confirmation they needed. The storm had passed, but it had left them sealed inside this small, cold world together. They were trapped, and, in the weighted quiet, both of them understood that the real storm might have only just begun. The second day began with the hard work of acknowledging their cage. Eli spent the morning digging a narrow path from the cabin door to the lean-to, his shovel biting into the heavy, wet snow. The world was blindingly white, the sky a seamless, brilliant blue that offered no warmth. The cold was a physical presence, sharp and clean in his lungs. He checked on Gideon, who was restless but unharmed, and then set to work on a shutter that had been loosened by the storm's fury, its constant banging a rhythm of decay he could not abide. As he worked, resetting the wood and securing the leather hinges, his eyes scanned the landscape. Everything was buried, softened, made foreign by the snow. But something caught his attention near the sparse line of pines at the edge of the clearing. Tracks. They were deep, partially filled by the last of the snowfall, but clear enough. A large animal, heavy-footed, or maybe several. He walked closer, his boots sinking deep. They were canine, the splay of the toes and the claw marks distinct. Wolves, most likely, driven down from the high country by hunger. But as he followed the line for a few yards, he saw another set of prints, overlapping the first. They were clumsy, less defined, a man's boots, nearly erased by the wind. Had someone been watching the cabin? Or had another soul, like him, been lost in the storm? He could not be sure. The uncertainty settled in his gut like a cold stone. He turned back to the cabin, the hammer in his hand feeling heavier, more necessary. Inside, Clara moved in a world of her own making, a realm of small, repetitive tasks that seemed to hold the silence at bay. She swept the hearth, though it was already clean. She polished a pewter spoon with a scrap of wool until it shone with a dull luster. She kneaded a small lump of dough for bread, her movements methodical and practiced. She was a ghost in her own home, gliding from one chore to the next, her presence defined by a profound and sorrowful quiet. Eli tried to draw her out, his questions simple and carefully chosen. "That's a lot of herbs," he said, nodding toward the bundles hanging from the rafters. She did not look up from her kneading. "My mother was a healer. She taught me which ones to gather, for fevers, for coughs, for easing pain." "She sounds like a good woman," he ventured. A flicker of something, warmth, or maybe just the memory of it, passed over her face. She knew how to make things grow. She saw the good in everything. The words hung in the air. A small, fragile testament to a time before the silence had taken root. Later, as she sliced the bread, he asked, "You lived here long?" "All my life," she whispered. "My father built this cabin. He died of a lung sickness when I was 10. My mother, she married Mr. Thorne a year later. She thought we needed a man to protect us." A shadow crossed her features, a bitter irony that needed no explanation. "She died 4 years ago. It's just been him and me since—" She fell silent then, and Eli did not push. He understood. The silence was her shield. It was the one thing her stepfather could not take from her. He saw how the townspeople could mistake that shield for a sign of weakness, of a mind that was not whole. They did not see the immense strength it took to carry such a heavy silence, to live with the words that were trapped behind it. That evening, the cabin felt smaller, the walls pressing in. They ate the fresh bread with the last of the stew, the shared meal and intimacy that was both comforting and tense. After they had finished, Clara took her Bible and sat by the fire, but she did not pray. She simply held the book in her lap. her fingers tracing the worn gold lettering on the cover. Eli mended a tear in his saddle blanket, his hands busy, his mind restless. He was acutely aware of her, of the soft sound of her breathing, of the way the firelight caught the stray wisps of her hair. He woke late in the night to a sound he almost did not recognize. It was a choked, desperate little gasp, the sound of a sob being swallowed before it could be born. He lay perfectly still on his mat, his eyes open in the darkness. The fire had burned low, but in the faint glow of the embers, he could see her. She was huddled on the hearth, her knees drawn up to her chest, her face buried in her arms. Her shoulders shook with a silent, racking grief. He watched her for a long time, his own ghosts stirring in the shadows. He knew this kind of sorrow, the kind that had no voice, the kind that ate you from the inside out. He thought to leave her be, to grant her the privacy of her pain, but the sight of her, so small and so utterly alone, moved something in him that he thought had long since turned to stone. Quietly, he rose from his mat. He moved to the water bucket, dipped a tin cup into the icy liquid, and walked over to her. He knelt beside her, not touching her, but close enough that she would know he was there. He held out the cup. "Here," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Drink some water." She started, her head snapping up. Her face was streaked with tears, her eyes wide and luminous in the dim light. She looked at him with a raw vulnerability that struck him to the core. She hesitated, then took the cup with a trembling hand, her fingers brushing against his. The touch was like a spark on dry tinder. She drank, the water seeming to calm the tremors that ran through her. She handed the cup back to him, her gaze fixed on his face. Searching. "Are you good?" she whispered. The question so direct, so simple. It disarmed him completely. She was not asking if he was a good man in the eyes of the law or the church. She was asking something deeper, something about the core of him. Was he a man who brought peace, or a man who brought more pain? Eli had no answer for her. He looked away, toward the dying embers of the fire. "I don't know," he said, the admission costing him more than she could ever realize. "I used to think I was a long time ago." He remained kneeling beside her, the silence between them no longer a shield, but a bridge. He found himself speaking, the words coming out rough and unpracticed, like stones pulled from a deep. Forgotten well. "I had a wife once," he began, his voice low and strained. "Her name was Sarah. We had a small piece of land down in the valley. We were building a life." He paused, the memory a physical weight in his chest. There were men, drifters who came through. They wanted what we had. They thought because we were alone, we were weak. He did not have to say the rest. The violence, the terror, the scream he could still feel in his own throat. It was all there in the tightening of his jaw, in the bleak emptiness of his eyes. "I went to the sheriff," he continued, his voice hardening. "The law. They said there was no proof. They said it was my word against theirs. They did nothing. They let them ride away. I learned then that the law only protects those who are already strong. It doesn't protect the innocent." He fell silent, the rage and helplessness of it still as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. "I buried her on our land, and I left. I couldn't stay in a place where justice was just a word. I stopped trusting people. I stopped trusting that anything could be made right." He had never told anyone this much. The words left him feeling raw, exposed. He looked at Clara. She was watching him, her earlier tears forgotten, her expression one of profound, empathetic sorrow. She understood. Slowly, hesitantly, she began to speak, her own story a quiet echo of his. "After my mother died," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "things changed. Mr. Thorne, he started drinking more. He didn't want people coming around. He said the world was full of wickedness and that he had to protect me." She twisted a loose thread on her sleeve. "There was a boy, Josiah. The preacher's son? We were meant to be married. He was kind. He would bring me wildflowers. She looked down at her hands, her voice growing even quieter. After Mother was gone, Mr. Thorne told him not to come anymore. He said I was in mourning, that I needed to be alone with my grief, but the mourning never ended. No one came anymore. They started to whisper in town that I was strange, that I preferred to be alone. She finally looked up at him, her eyes clear and filled with a devastating honesty. I have never been kissed, Mr. Danner. I have never held a man's hand, other than my father's, or Josiah's once at a church social. I have been kept here, hidden away, until I have forgotten what it feels like to be seen. The confession hung between them, a fragile, heartbreaking truth. Eli felt a surge of protectiveness so fierce it almost choked him. This girl, with her quiet strength and her deep, hidden well of pain, was the epitome of the innocent the world had failed to protect. He was the drifter, the man who had lost his faith, and she was the devout girl who had been imprisoned by the man who was supposed to be her guardian. In the days that followed, the unspoken tension between them grew. A current of electricity in the confined space. It was in the way he caught her watching him when she thought he was not looking, her gaze curious and hesitant. It was in the way his eyes would follow her as she moved about the cabin, a quiet admiration for her resilience warring with the anger he felt on her behalf. They spoke more, sharing small details of their lives, filling the silence with fragments of who they were or who they might have been. He told her about breaking horses in Texas, about the beauty of a desert sunset. She told him about her mother's garden, about the names of the constellations she had learned from a book. They were two lonely souls, slowly, cautiously, finding a reflection in each other's eyes. One afternoon, as she stood by the window, looking out at the endless sea of white, she spoke without turning around, her voice small but clear. Sometimes, she confessed, I wish someone would come and take me away from here. It was not a plea. It was a simple statement of fact, a truth laid bare. It was the deepest wish of a heart that had all but given up on hope. And Eli heard it not as a request, but as a calling. It was the echo of a promise he had failed to keep once before. That night, the air in the cabin was thick with unspoken things. A light snow had begun to fall again, the flakes drifting down in the silent darkness, further sealing them in. After their meager meal, Eli went outside to check on Gideon, needing the sharp bite of the cold air to clear his head. When he returned, he pushed the door open to a scene that stopped his heart. Clara was sitting on the hearth, facing the fire. She had changed into a simple, white cotton nightgown. Her hair was unbraided, falling in a soft, brown wave over her shoulders. The firelight cast a warm, golden glow on her skin, making her look like a saint in an old painting. She was waiting, her posture, her stillness, the vulnerability of her bare feet on the cold stone. It was a silent, desperate offering. She was offering him a way to take her away, at least for a moment, from the prison of her life. Eli stepped inside and quietly closed the door behind him, the sound of the latch clicking into place unnaturally loud in the silent room. She did not turn, but he saw her stiffen slightly, her hands clutching in her lap. He knew what she was offering. He knew the depths of the loneliness and pain that had brought her to this moment, and a part of him, the broken, lonely part that had been wandering for 5 years, wanted to accept. He wanted to cross the room, to touch her, to feel the warmth of another human being and forget, just for a night, the ghosts that haunted him. But then he saw the faint shadow of the bruises on her wrist, visible in the firelight. He saw the tremor in her shoulders. He saw not a woman offering her body, but a girl so wounded she believed her body was the only thing of value she had left to give. And he knew, with a certainty that cut through his own selfish desires, that to touch her now would be to become just like the men he despised. He would be just another man who took from her, who used her pain to soothe his own. He walked slowly across the room, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. She flinched as he drew near, squeezing her eyes shut, waiting, but he did not stop beside her. He walked past her. He picked up a blanket from his mat and went to sit in the chair at the table, a few feet away, placing himself between her and the door. He was no longer just a guest. He was a sentry. She opened her eyes, confusion and a new, deeper hurt dawning on her face. She thought he was rejecting her, that she was not wanted, even by a stranger. He had to speak, to make her understand. He kept his voice low, a rough whisper that was more gentle than any shout could ever be. "Not like this," he said, his eyes on the fire. "Not when you're hurting." He did not look at her, but he felt the meaning of his words settle over her. He felt her silent gasp, the slow release of the tension in her shoulders. He had not rejected her. He had seen her. He had seen her pain, and he had chosen to guard it, not to use it. He sat in the chair, the blanket wrapped around his shoulders, a silent protector in the night. Outside, the snow fell, covering the world in a blanket of pure, unsullied white. And inside the small cabin, a wounded cowboy sat watch over a waiting girl, guarding her not from the dangers of the world outside, but from the temptation of becoming one of them himself. The night of his refusal changed the air between them. The tension did not disappear, but it transformed. The fragile, dangerous spark of desperation was gone, replaced by something quieter, deeper, and far more unnerving, a nascent trust. When Clara awoke the next morning, she did not look at him with shame, but with a quiet, searching curiosity. And when Eli met her gaze, he did so not as a stranger passing through, but as a man who had made a choice. He had chosen to stay, and in doing so, had become a part of her story. The storm had broken, but its aftermath was a silent, formidable barrier. The sun shone weakly through a thin veil of clouds, casting a dull, flat light on a world buried in white. The trail was an impassable memory, the drifts deep and treacherous. They were still prisoners of the weather, but the walls of their prison no longer felt like they were closing in. Instead, the small cabin had become a world unto itself, a temporary sanctuary from everything that lay beyond the snow. They settled into a restrained domesticity. He would chop wood from the dwindling pile in the lean-to. His axe strokes a steady, percussive rhythm in the vast silence. She would cook, her movements economical and graceful, the simple act of preparing food a prayer of its own. They spoke little, but their silence was no longer heavy with fear. It was a shared quiet, a space where they could simply be. He learned the rhythm of her days, the way she would pause to look out the window in the late afternoon, the way she hummed a tuneless, melancholic hymn while she mended a seam. She, in turn, learned the shape of his presence, the way he stood by the door before stepping outside, his body tensed as if expecting a threat, the way he cleaned his gun with a focused intensity that was almost meditative. One afternoon, he was inspecting a long-barreled rifle that rested on pegs above the fireplace. It was an old model, well-kept but clearly unused. He took it down, his large hands expert as he checked the action and sighted down the barrel. "Is this your stepfather's?" he asked, his voice casual. Clara looked up from the beans she was sorting. "Yes, he has not fired it in years. He says his hands shake too much now." Eli worked the lever, the metallic click sharp and decisive in the quiet room. "Do you know how to use it?" She shook her head, a flicker of apprehension in her eyes. "No, I do not like them. The noise—" "The noise is the least important thing about it," he said, his tone serious. He looked at her, his gaze direct. "A woman alone out here ought to know how to use one, just in case." The words "just in case" hung in the air, a plain-spoken acknowledgement of the dangers he saw, the dangers that had nothing to do with the snow or the wolves. He was not just passing time. He was preparing her. He took her outside, into the blinding white of the clearing. The air was still and frigid. He set up a small, dark stone on a distant snow-covered stump. "This is a tool, Clara," he explained, his voice patient. "Nothing more. It does what you tell it to do. You have to be calm. You have to be steady." He showed her how to hold it, how to brace the wooden stock against her shoulder, his hands briefly touching hers to adjust her grip. She was stiff and awkward at first, the weapon heavy and foreign in her arms. But as he talked her through it, his voice a low, steady murmur, she began to relax. "Breathe out slow," he instructed, standing behind her. "Line up the sight at the end of the barrel with the notch back here. Make them frame that rock. Do not jerk the trigger. Squeeze it, slow and steady, like you're wringing out a cloth." She squinted, her brow furrowed in concentration. She took a breath, let it out, and squeezed. The rifle's report was a violent crack that shattered the stillness, echoing off the silent pines. The recoil slammed the stock into her shoulder, making her stagger back a step. The stone on the stump remained untouched. She looked crestfallen, rubbing her shoulder. "I missed." "Everyone misses the first time," he said. "You flinched. You were thinking about the noise, about the kick. Do not think about them. Just think about the rock. Nothing else exists but you, the rifle, and that rock." They tried again and again. Each time, the blast seemed to shake the very air, but each time, she grew a little steadier. He saw something in her then that surprised him, a deep, unwavering focus. The skittish, frightened girl disappeared, and in her place was a woman of intense, quiet concentration. Her hands, which he had only seen tremble or perform simple domestic tasks, were surprisingly steady. On the fourth shot, a puff of snow and rock dust exploded from the stump, just to the left of the stone. "Closer," he said, a note of approval in his voice. "You are pulling it just a bit. Try again." She reloaded, her movements becoming more fluid, more confident. She raised the rifle, took her breath, and fired. The sharp crack was followed a split second later by the satisfying ping of lead-hitting stone. The target disappeared from the stump. A slow smile spread across Eli's face. "Good shot." Clara lowered the rifle, a look of stunned disbelief on her face. She looked at the empty stump, then at the heavy weapon in her hands, and then at him. A strange, bubbling sound rose in her throat. It was an unfamiliar sound, rusty from disuse. At first, it was a nervous, breathy chuckle, but then it broke free, turning into a genuine, clear laugh. It was not a loud laugh, but it filled the cold air with a warmth that the sun could not provide. The sound transformed her. It smoothed the lines of worry from her forehead, put a bright, living spark in her eyes, and softened the tight set of her mouth. For the first time, Eli saw not the haunted girl from the cabin, but the young woman she might have been, the woman she could still become. He found himself smiling back at her, a real smile that reached his eyes. And in that shared moment of surprise and triumph, the last of the walls between them crumbled into dust. That evening, the mood in the cabin was lighter than it had been since his arrival. They talked more freely, the shared experience of the shooting lesson having forged a new kind of bond. As she was tending to the fire, adding a log to the grate, the heavy iron stove door swung unexpectedly. She cried out, a sharp intake of breath, and snatched her hand back. Eli was at her side in an instant. "What is it? What happened?" She was cradling her left hand, her face pale with pain, her eyes wide with shock. "The door! I burned myself!" "Let me see," he said, his voice firm but gentle. He took her arm, turning her hand over in his. A raw, angry red mark was already blistering on the soft flesh of her palm and fingers. "Sit down," he commanded softly, leading her to one of the chairs. He went to the water bucket, soaked a clean rag in the icy water, and returned to her, kneeling before her. He gently pressed the cool cloth to the burn. She winced, biting her lip to keep from crying out again. "Just hold still," he murmured. The cold will help. He held the compress against her skin, his thumb stroking the back of her wrist in a small, comforting gesture. They were so close now that he could see the faint freckles scattered across the bridge of her nose, the way her long eyelashes cast shadows on her cheeks. He could smell the clean, simple scent of her, like fresh bread and wood smoke. The rest of the world fell away. The cabin, the snow, the storm, all of it gone, leaving only this small, intimate circle of quiet care. After a few minutes, he removed the cloth. He went to a small pouch in his saddlebags and took out a tin of salve. Returning to her, he gently dabbed the soothing ointment onto the angry red skin. His touch was incredibly tender, a stark contrast to the rough, calloused hands of a man who had lived his life by the gun and the reins. Clara watched him, her breathing shallow. Her eyes were fixed on his face, which was etched with a deep, focused concern. When he was finished, he did not immediately let go of her hand. He held it cradled in his own, his gaze meeting hers. The air grew thick, charged with all the things they had not said, all the things they were starting to feel. Her voice, when she spoke, was a near whisper, trembling and fragile. "Would you still want me, if you knew what he did?" The question struck Eli like a physical blow. It was the question of a woman who believed she was fundamentally spoiled, ruined, unworthy of tenderness. The wanting she spoke of was not the simple desire he had seen in her eyes the night before. It was a deeper wanting, a question of her very worth. Eli said nothing. He could not. The words caught in his throat, choked by a sudden, blinding rage. He saw the bruises on her wrist again, not as faint memories, but as fresh, ugly marks. He heard the unspoken words behind her question, the years of pain, fear, and degradation. A muscle in his jaw tightened, a hard knot of fury. His silence was not a rejection, but the stillness of a storm gathering its strength. Seeing the darkness that passed over his face, she mistook it for disgust. Her own face crumpled, the carefully constructed calm shattering into 1,000 pieces. A choked sob escaped her lips, and then another. The truth, held back for so long, finally broke free, pouring out of her in a torrent of anguish. He hurts me," she wept, the words torn from her. Not just with his fists. He says I am his now, that my mother left me for him. He says that I owe him, that I am wicked, that my soul is stained, and that this is my penance." She broke down completely, her body racked with sobs. The full, ugly weight of her secret finally released into the small, warm space of the cabin. Eli's face was a mask of cold fury. He gently placed her hand in her lap. He did not pull her into his arms. He did not stroke her hair or offer empty words of comfort. To touch her now, in the midst of this raw, agonizing confession, would be to make it about himself, about his comfort. Instead, he gave her the one thing she had never been given. He gave her validation. He looked directly into her tear-filled eyes, his own gaze burning with a cold, clear fire. And he said, his voice low and steady and absolute, "That's not your shame." He stood up, his movements stiff and controlled. He turned and walked to the door, lifted the bar, and stepped out into the biting cold of the evening, slamming the door shut behind him. The sound was like a gunshot. Outside, the world was shades of blue and gray in the twilight. The fury inside him was a white-hot, living thing, and it needed a release. He walked to the nearest pine tree at the edge of the clearing, its trunk thick and unyielding, and with a raw, guttural cry that was torn from the depths of his soul, he punched it. The impact was a sharp, brutal shock that ran up his arm. He punched it again, and again, the hard bark splitting under the force of his blows, his knuckles cracking, oblivious to the pain. He was not just hitting a tree, he was hitting the faceless men who had destroyed his life. He was hitting the indifferent law that had failed him. And most of all, he was hitting Jebediah Thorne, the man who had stolen the light from the eyes of the girl inside the cabin. When the rage was finally spent, he leaned his forehead against the rough bark, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His right hand was a bloody, mangled mess. The sharp, physical pain was a welcome anchor, something to focus on besides the churning sickness in his gut. He stayed there for a long time, the cold air washing over him, until the world stopped spinning. When he finally went back inside, he found Clara sitting just as he had left her. Her tears had subsided, leaving her looking pale and exhausted. But a strange sort of peace had settled over her features. She looked up as he entered, her eyes immediately falling to his bleeding hand. She said nothing, but rose from her chair, took the rag he had used on her burn, and re-soaked it in the water bucket. She came to him and, without a word, began to gently clean the blood and splinters from his knuckles. Her touch was as tender as his had been. When she was done, she tore a strip from a clean cloth and carefully bandaged his hand. That night, after the fire had been banked and the cabin was draped in shadows, he lay on his mat, his bandaged hand throbbing with a dull ache. He heard her leave her cot and cross the room. He thought she was going to the hearth to pray, but she stopped beside him. She knelt down and, after a moment's hesitation, she laid her small, warm hand over his injured one. The touch was light, a gesture of shared hurt, of solace given and received. "You stayed," she whispered into the darkness, her voice filled with a quiet wonder. "You're the first man who ever stayed." The confession, once spoken, could not be taken back. It lay between them, a raw and terrible truth that had irrevocably altered the shape of their confinement. The cabin was no longer a sanctuary. It was a crime scene, and Eli was no longer a guest. He was a witness. He looked at Clara, and he saw not just a wounded girl, but a survivor of a war that had been fought in total silence. Her quietness was not emptiness. It was a landscape of scars. They passed the next day in a state of heightened awareness. Every small gesture was freighted with their shared knowledge. When he passed her a cup of water, his bandaged hand brushing hers, it was an acknowledgement of their intertwined pain. When she set a bowl of stew before him, her eyes met his for a fraction of a second longer than before, a silent expression of gratitude that went far beyond simple hospitality. The physical restraint between them remained, but the emotional distance had vanished. They were two solitary people who had, against all odds, found the one other person in the world who could understand the language of their wounds. The end came in the dead of night. Eli was a light sleeper, a habit born of years on the trail where any unfamiliar sound could mean the difference between waking up and not. He was drifting in that shallow space between awareness and sleep when he heard it. It was a sound that did not belong to the natural world of wind and snow. It was the rhythmic, labored crunch of a horse plowing through deep drifts, accompanied by the faint, metallic jingle of a harness. He was on his feet in an instant, his hand reaching for the Colt peacemaker that lay beside his mat. He moved to the window, peering through a small crack in the shutter. A single rider on a weary-looking roan was making his way into the clearing. The man was a broad, hulking shape in the moonlight, his movements clumsy and unsteady. As he drew closer, Eli heard him utter a low, drunken curse as the horse stumbled. It was him, Jebediah Thorne. Eli turned to Clara. She was already sitting bolt upright on her cot, her eyes wide with a terror that was stark and absolute. All the fragile progress they had made, the laughter, the shared confidence, was gone, erased in a single heartbeat. She was the trapped animal again, hearing the footsteps of the hunter. "Stay calm," Eli whispered, his voice a low, urgent command. "I was a drifter. The storm caught me, that is all. Do you understand?" She nodded, her body trembling, her face a pale mask in the gloom. The heavy thud of boots on the wooden porch followed, then a loud, impatient banging on the door. "Clara, open this damn door! It's freezing out here!" The voice was a gravelly roar, slurred with whiskey. Clara looked at Eli, her eyes pleading. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. She rose from the cot, her movements wooden, and slid the heavy bar from the door. Jebediah Thorne filled the doorway, bringing the biting cold and the stench of sour whiskey and wet wool in with him. He was a big man, gone to seed, his face florid and puffy, with small, mean eyes set deep in folds of flesh. He stomped the snow from his boots, his gaze sweeping the small cabin and landing, with open hostility, on Eli. "What the hell is this?" Thorne growled, his eyes narrowing into suspicious slits. Eli remained where he was, near the fireplace. His posture relaxed, but his body coiled with a readiness that only another dangerous man would recognize. "Storm caught me," he said, his voice even and calm. "Your daughter was good enough to offer me a place to wait it out. I'm grateful." Thorne grunted, his gaze shifting from Eli to Clara and back again, searching for some sign of collusion. Clara stood by the open door, her face a carefully constructed blank, her eyes fixed on a point on the far wall. She had retreated so far into herself she was barely there. "Heard the storm was bad," Thorne said, still not convinced. He shed his heavy, snow-crusted coat, revealing a stained flannel shirt and suspenders straining over a prominent gut. "You can be on your way in the morning." It was not an offer. It was a dismissal. "I plan to," Eli said. Thorne turned his attention to Clara, his expression souring into a contemptuous sneer. "Well, girl, ain't you going to get me some supper? Or have you been too busy entertaining guests?" He gestured around the small, sparse cabin. "Look at this place, cold as a tomb, good for nothing but firewood and prayer. This one," he laughed, a short, ugly bark of a sound. "Wasting her time talking to a god who ain't listening, while the fire goes out." Clara flinched as if he had struck her, but her expression remained impassive. Without a word, she moved to the hearth, her back to both men, and began to ladle some of the leftover stew into a bowl. The indifference she projected was a masterpiece of self-preservation, a performance she had clearly perfected over years of abuse. Eli watched, his bandaged hand clenching into a fist, the knuckles screaming in protest. He forced himself to unclench it, finger by painful finger. To react now would be to light a fuse, and he did not know how much powder was in the keg. Thorne slumped into one of the chairs at the table, pulling a flask from his pocket and taking a long, gurgling swallow. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and eyed Eli again. "You a ranch hand?" "Sometimes," Eli said. "Looking for work?" "Just passing through." Thorne grunted again, seemingly satisfied with the short, uninformative answers. He was a man who understood transients, men who appeared out of nowhere and disappeared just as quickly. They were not a threat to his established order. Clara brought the bowl of stew and a piece of bread to the table, setting them down before her stepfather without looking at him. Her movements were quick and efficient, her only goal to retreat from his presence as quickly as possible. But as she turned to go, Thorne's hand shot out and clamped around her wrist, the same wrist that had borne the faded bruises. "Where do you think you're going?" he snarled, his grip tightening. "You sit. A man likes to have a woman watch him eat." "Please," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. "I am tired." "You'll be tired when I say you're tired," he roared, his face darkening with drunken rage. He yanked her arm, pulling her off balance. "You think you can just hide away from me, after I've been out in that hellish snow for 2 weeks, trying to keep this worthless patch of dirt from falling apart? You owe me respect." That was the moment the fuse was lit. In the space of a single heartbeat, Eli crossed the room. He did not shout, he did not threaten. He simply grabbed the back of Thorne's collar with his good hand and hauled the bigger man backward, chair and all. The chair crashed to the floor, spilling Thorne onto the rough-hewn planks in a tangle of limbs and curses. Eli placed himself between Thorne and the girl, his body a solid, immovable wall. "Let her go," Eli said, his voice dangerously quiet. Thorn scrambled to his feet, his face purple with fury and surprise. "You dare put your hands on me in my own home?" he bellowed, spittle flying from his lips. He lunged at Eli, his fists flailing like a barroom brawler. The fight was short, brutal, and ugly. Thorn was bigger and heavier, but he was drunk and clumsy. Eli was faster, harder, and fueled by a righteous rage that had been simmering for days. He sidestepped Thorn's wild punch, landing a sharp, precise blow to the man's gut that drove the air from his lungs in a wheezing gasp. Thorn staggered back, and Eli followed, his fists moving with a grim efficiency. He hit him with a right that snapped his head back and a left that split his lip open. He drove Thorn back against the wall, the impact shaking the whole cabin. Thorn slid to the floor, dazed and bleeding. The cold, clean rage that Eli had unleashed on the tree was back, but this time it had a human target. He saw not just Thorn, but all the men who used their strength to prey on the weak. He saw the drifters who had taken his Sarah. He raised his bandaged fist, the pain a distant, unimportant signal, ready to bring it down and finish it, to crush the man's face and silence his vile voice forever. "Eli, no!" Clara's scream cut through the red haze of his anger. It was not a scream of terror, but a plea. He froze, his fist poised in the air. He looked at her. She was standing by the fireplace, her hands pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. Not at what Thorn had done, but at what Eli was about to become. The rage receded, leaving him cold and shaking. He lowered his hand. He had almost done it. He had almost become the monster to slay the monster. Thorn, gasping on the floor, wiped a smear of blood from his mouth. A slow, malevolent smile spread across his bruised face. He had been beaten physically, but he saw his path to victory. "You'll hang for this," he hissed, scrambling to his feet. "Assaulting a man on his own property. Trespassing. The sheriff in Redemption is a friend of mine. He'll listen to me. I'll tell him you were trying to have your way with my girl. That I caught you and you attacked me." He staggered to the door, grabbing his coat. "I'm going to go get him. I'm coming back with men and the law. And you bastard, will swing from a rope. And you," he snarled, pointing a trembling finger at Clara, "you'll pay for this. You'll learn what happens to ungrateful, wicked little things like you." He stumbled out into the night, leaving the door hanging open. They heard him fumbling with his horse's reins, cursing, and then the sound of the horse galloping away, its hoofbeats fading into the vast, snowy silence. The cold air flooded the cabin. Clara rushed to the door and barred it, then turned to Eli, her face a mask of frantic desperation. "You have to go," she begged, her voice cracking. "Now, before he comes back. He means it. Sheriff Miller is his drinking partner. They will not listen to you. They will kill you." Eli stood in the center of the room, his breathing still ragged from the fight. He looked at the mess, the overturned chair, the spilled stew, the drops of blood on the floor. He looked at her, at the raw terror in her eyes, a terror that was now entirely for him. To run now would be the sensible thing to do. It was what the drifter, Eli Danner, had always done. He ran from the past. He ran from connection. He ran from trouble. But he was not just a drifter anymore. He was the man who had stayed. He shook his head slowly. "No." "But they will hang you," she cried, grabbing his arm. "You do not understand." "I understand perfectly," he said, his voice regaining its steady calm. He looked down at her, his gaze unwavering. "You're not going to face him alone again." The finality in his voice silenced her protests. She stared at him, her lips parted in disbelief. In his eyes, she saw not a reckless fool, but a man who had drawn a line in the dirt from which he would not retreat. The terror in her own eyes slowly gave way to a dawning, fragile hope. Then what do we do? She whispered. We prepare, he said. We ride, at first light. The next hour was a blur of focused activity. The threat of Thorn's return sharpened their senses, lending an urgency to every action. Eli showed her how to pack essentials into a bedroll, a spare blanket, the leftover bread, a small tin of his coffee. He taught her how to tie it securely behind a saddle, a skill she had never needed. He took Gideon's saddle and, after some adjustments, fitted it onto the back of the placid old plow horse in the lean-to. It was not a fast horse, but it was sturdy. While she packed a small cloth bag with a few of her mother's belongings, he gave her his spare knife, its blade sharp and clean. Keep this with you, he said, showing her how to strap the sheath to her belt, hidden under her dress. You only use it if you have no other choice. You aim for the soft parts, under the chin, in the belly. Do you understand? She nodded, her face grim, her hand resting on the hilt of the knife as if for reassurance. When they were done, when the two horses were saddled and ready, when their meager supplies were packed, a strange quiet descended on the cabin. It was the last time they would be in this place together. The fire in the hearth had burned low, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. It was the same fire that had welcomed him, the same fire by which she had prayed, the same fire that had witnessed her confession and his refusal. Clara lingered by the hearth, her hand resting on the rough stone of the mantelpiece. She was saying goodbye to the only home she had ever known, a place of immense pain, but also of a sudden, unexpected transformation. Eli walked to stand a few feet away from her, respecting her silence. After a long moment, she turned to face him. The firelight played in her eyes, and in their depths, he saw a new and terrifying courage. If you do not kiss me now, she said, her voice clear and steady, devoid of any pleading, I will never believe I am anything but broken. It was not a request for passion. It was a demand for validation. It was her final act of defiance against her stepfather's words, against the shame that had been her constant companion. She needed to know, before she stepped out into the unknown world, that she was not the stained, wicked thing he had named her. She needed to be sealed by a touch that was not violent, not selfish, not an act of taking, but an act of giving. Eli looked at her, at the fierce, fragile hope in her eyes. He saw the strength she had found in the last few days, the woman who had learned to shoot, who had confessed her deepest shame, and who was now ready to ride into a dangerous world. He stepped forward, closing the small distance between them. He gently raised his bandaged hand and cupped her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was slow and achingly tender. It was not a kiss of passion or of desperate need, but of reverence. It was a promise, a prayer, an answer. It was the taste of coffee and wood smoke, of shared sorrow and a dawning hope. It was real, and in that kiss, by the dying fire, in the moments before the dawn, Eli Danner sealed his vow, not with words, but with a touch that told her, more powerfully than any sermon ever could, that she was not broken. She was whole. They rode out in the bruised purple light of pre-dawn, two solitary figures against a vast, indifferent canvas of white. The air was cold, sharp, and unforgiving, and every breath was a small, sharp pain. Eli led the way on Gideon, breaking a trail through the deep snow, his shoulders set in a line of grim determination. Clara followed on the lumbering plow horse, her face wrapped in a wool scarf, only her wide, watchful eyes visible. She rode with a straight-backed stillness that was not born of skill, but of sheer, unbending will. They did not speak. There was nothing to say that had not already been said in the charged silence of the cabin. They were fugitives now, bound together by a shared secret and a common enemy. Eli's plan was simple, born of a desperate hope. 2 days' ride to the west was the town of Haven's Rest, a place larger and more established than Redemption. And in that town lived Judge Alistair Blackwood, a man Eli had known years ago, before the world had turned sour on him. Blackwood was a rare thing in this lawless land. An honest man, a man who believed the law was a shield for the weak, not just a club for the strong. He was their only chance. The first day was a grueling test of endurance. The horses struggled. The cold was relentless, and the silence of the snow-covered wilderness was absolute. They stopped only once, at midday, to rest the animals and eat a piece of dry bread. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the snow in shades of rose and violet, Eli led them off the barely there trail and into a narrow, sheltered canyon carved by an ancient river. Here, protected from the wind, he made a small fire. The flames leaped up, a welcome splash of orange and gold in the deepening blue twilight. They sat on a fallen log, close to the warmth, the steam from their tin cups of coffee mingling in the frigid air. For a long time, they simply watched the flames, each lost in their own thoughts. The fight, the flight, the terrifying uncertainty of their future. It all seemed to recede in the face of the fire's simple, honest warmth. Clara, who had been shivering almost imperceptibly for hours, finally grew still. She extended her hands toward the fire, her profile soft and contemplative in the flickering light. "I do not feel cold anymore," she whispered, the words a small puff of white in the air. Eli looked at her. He knew she was not talking about the weather. She was talking about the deep, internal chill of fear and loneliness that had been her companion for years. In the shared danger, in the simple act of being beside someone who believed her, a different kind of warmth had begun to kindle inside her. He said nothing, but reached out with his good hand and briefly, gently, squeezed her shoulder. It was all the answer she needed. They reached the outskirts of Haven's Rest late the next afternoon, weary to the bone. The town was a proper settlement, with a wide, muddy main street, a 2-story hotel, and the solid, imposing brick edifice of a county courthouse. But as they rode in, Eli felt a prickle of unease. Men on the boardwalk stopped to stare at them, their expressions not of simple curiosity, but of cold, hard judgment. Whispers followed them like a foul wind. He saw Thorne's roan tied outside the saloon and his blood ran cold. The man was here. He had ridden hard and arrived first. The truth of their situation became brutally clear when a stout, grim-faced man with a sheriff's star pinned to his coat stepped out in front of them, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. It was not Sheriff Miller from Redemption, but this man's eyes held the same dismissive arrogance. "That's far enough," the sheriff said, his gaze fixed on Eli. "Jebediah Thorne has been telling the whole town how a drifter took advantage of his hospitality and ran off with his simple-minded stepdaughter. Abduction is a hanging offense in this county." "That's a lie," Eli said, his voice low and steady, keeping his hands in plain sight on the pommel of his saddle. "That's for the judge to decide," the sheriff retorted. "For now, you're coming with me." "We're here to see Judge Blackwood," Eli stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We came here by choice, to seek his counsel." The sheriff hesitated. The judge's name carried weight. To deny a man a meeting with the county judge was a step he was clearly unwilling to take without more cause. He grunted, his eyes flicking to Clara, who sat frozen on her horse, her face hidden by her scarf. "Fine, the judge is in his chambers at the courthouse, but I'll be watching you." As they dismounted, the whispers of the townsfolk grew louder. They were a spectacle. The dangerous-looking drifter with the bandaged hand, and the strange, silent girl who had been abducted. The story was simple, compelling, and ugly. Some of the townspeople looked at Clara with pity, others with a prurient curiosity. They saw what Thorne had told them to see. Just as they were about to step onto the boardwalk, a woman's voice cut through the murmurs. "Clara? Clara May, is that you?" An older woman, her face lined with kindness and her hair pulled back in a neat silver bun, bustled toward them from the door of a boarding house. She wiped her hands on her apron. her eyes sharp and intelligent, taking in the entire scene: Clara's frightened posture, Eli's grim face, the sheriff's hostile stance. Clara looked at the woman, and for the first time, a flicker of recognition, of something other than fear, appeared in her eyes. "Mrs. Gable?" she whispered. "Martha Gable," the woman said, her voice warm but firm as she reached them. She gently took Clara's arm, ignoring the sheriff completely. "I knew your mother, child. A finer woman never drew breath. You have her eyes." She looked from Clara's pale face to Eli, then back again, her expression softening with a clear, unwavering belief. "You look like you have been through a great trial. Come inside. You will be safe with me." "Now hold on, Martha," the sheriff began, stepping forward. "Mrs. Gable fixed him with a stare as hard as iron. "You will do no such thing. Thomas, this girl needs a safe place to rest, not a jail cell. She will stay here, under my roof and my protection, until Judge Blackwood says otherwise. Now, unless you plan on arresting a tax-paying widow for offering comfort to her dear departed friend's child, I suggest you go about your business." The sheriff, outmaneuvered and clearly unwilling to cross the formidable Mrs. Gable, flushed a deep red. He grumbled under his breath and backed away, though he took up a watchful position across the street. Mrs. Gable ushered them into the warm, clean-smelling interior of her boarding house. She gave them a room at the back, a simple space with a bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out onto a small, snow-covered garden. It felt like the safest place in the world. Later, Eli went to the courthouse alone. He found Judge Blackwood in his chambers, a severe, gray-haired man with a deeply lined face and eyes that seemed to see right through to a man's soul. He listened patiently, without interruption, as Eli told him everything, from the moment he arrived at the cabin to the fight and their flight. He showed the judge his still raw knuckles. When Eli was finished, the judge leaned back in his leather chair, his fingertips pressed together. "I have known Jebediah Thorne for years," he said, his voice a deep, thoughtful rumble. "I have seen him sink into the bottle and bitterness. I have also heard the whispers about his stepdaughter, but whispers are not evidence. Mr. Danner." "She has bruises," Eli said. "Mrs. Gable is a witness to her state of mind." "A bruise proves a bruise, not its source," the judge countered, his voice heavy with the impartial weight of the law. "And a woman's intuition, however sound, will not stand against a father's testimony in a court of law. Thorne claims you are an opportunist who preyed on a vulnerable girl. He has the local sheriff on his side. It becomes his word against yours. And I am afraid in the eyes of many. He is a landowner, and you are a drifter." The cold, hard truth of their situation settled over Eli. The law, even an honest law, was a machine that required fuel, and they did not have enough. "So what can we do?" he asked, his voice tight. Judge Blackwood looked at him, his gaze softening with a hint of compassion. "There is only one person whose testimony can overcome Thorne's. Only one person whose word can give weight to the bruises and the whispers." He paused, letting the full import of his statement settle. "It is not enough, unless Clara speaks." When Eli returned to the boarding house and told her, Clara seemed to shrink into herself. The thought of standing before a room full of strangers, of speaking her shame aloud, was a terror beyond anything she had yet faced. To speak would be to make it real in a way it had never been before, to give it form and substance in the ears of the world. She sat on the edge of the bed, trembling, her hands twisting in her lap. Eli did not pressure her. He simply sat in a chair across from her and waited. "You do not have to do this, Clara," he said softly. "We can ride on. We can disappear." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a terrible conflict. To run would be to live forever with the secret, to live as the weird girl, the simple-minded runaway. She would be safe, perhaps, but she would never be free. She would always be the shame that her stepfather had named her. Slowly, deliberately, she stood up. The trembling did not stop, but a new, steely resolve entered her eyes. "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "No more running." The hearing was held the next day in the main hall of the courthouse. The room was packed. Thorne was there, his face bruised and swollen, a look of righteous indignation plastered on it for all to see. He sat with the sheriff from Redemption, who looked smug and confident. The townsfolk of Haven's Rest filled the benches, their faces a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and sympathy. Judge Blackwood presided, his presence a commanding force for order. Thorne was called to speak first. He told a fluent, practiced lie, painting himself as a concerned, grieving father who had been protecting his fragile, mentally unstable stepdaughter, only to have her stolen away by a violent, manipulative stranger. He spoke of Eli's attack with feigned outrage. It was a convincing performance. Then, the judge called Clara's name. A hush fell over the room, with Mrs. Gable on one side and Eli on the other. Clara walked to the front of the room. She stood before the judge's bench, a small, solitary figure in her plain homespun dress. She was trembling so hard it seemed a strong wind could knock her over. "Miss May," the judge said, his voice gentle, "please, tell the court what happened." Clara looked out at the sea of faces, at the people who had called her strange, who had whispered about her behind her back. She saw their judgment, their doubt. Her throat was dry. For a moment, it seemed no words would come. Then her eyes found Eli's. He stood by the wall, his gaze locked on hers, steady and unwavering. He believed her, and in that moment, she found her voice. She turned her gaze from Eli to the judge, and then she let it sweep across the faces of the town. She spoke, her voice not loud, but clear and resonant in the silent room. "For 4 years, I have lived in silence," she began. "People thought I was strange. They thought my mind was not right. They did not know that my silence was a prison, built for me by that man." She pointed a trembling finger at Jebediah Thorne. "He told me I was wicked. He told me my soul was stained. He told me that my shame was a punishment from God." She took a deep, shuddering breath, her eyes blazing with a fire no one in that room had ever seen before. She stood up straighter, the trembling in her limbs seeming to cease. "But I have learned that the shame was never mine to carry." She looked directly at her stepfather, her voice ringing with the pure, unassailable power of the truth. "I was never the shame," she declared. "He was—" The courtroom was utterly silent. Thorne's face went white, then mottled with purple rage. The simple, profound honesty of her statement had demolished his entire facade of lies. Then, in the back of the room, a woman stood up. She was a farmer's wife, her face worn and tired. She did not say a word. She simply stood. A moment later, another woman rose, a shopkeeper's young wife, then another and another. Mrs. Gable stood tall beside the witness stand. Across the room, women of all ages, women who had perhaps suffered their own silent shames, who had endured the cruelty of men like Thorne, rose to their feet in a silent, powerful wave of solidarity. They were not just standing for Clara. They were standing for themselves. Judge Blackwood looked out at the standing women, his expression unreadable. He looked at Thorne's sputtering, guilty face, and then at Clara, who stood before him, no longer trembling, but filled with a quiet, luminous strength. He brought his gavel down with a sharp, final crack. "Jebediah Thorne," he announced, his voice booming through the hall. "You are hereby arrested for the grievous abuse and endangerment of a ward. Sheriff Miller," he added, his gaze shifting to the man from Redemption. "You are relieved of your duties, pending an investigation into your complicity in covering up these crimes." He looked at Clara, and for the first time, a small, respectful smile touched his lips. Miss May, you are free. The wheels of justice, once set in motion, ground slowly but with an inexorable force. Jebediah Thorne was held in the county jail, his drunken bluster fading into a sullen, fearful silence as the weight of his sins finally found purchase. The disgraced sheriff from Redemption was sent packing, his tarnished star a symbol of a trust betrayed. For Eli and Clara, the verdict was not an ending, but a difficult, uncertain beginning. The town of Haven's Rest had witnessed her testimony, but the whispers did not die overnight. She was still an object of curiosity, a puzzle to be figured out. They did not leave. To run now would be to dishonor the truth she had fought so hard to speak. Mrs. Gable, a rock of steadfast compassion, insisted they stay with her, giving them the small apartment above her boarding house. It was 2 simple rooms, but to Clara, who had known only the oppressive confines of the cabin, it was a palace. For the first time, she had a door she could close, a space that was entirely her own, free from the shadow of a menacing presence. The first few weeks were a fragile, tentative exploration of this new life. Clara rarely ventured out, spending her days in the quiet company of the widow, Mrs. Gable, with a wisdom born of her own long life. Did not push. She simply included Clara in the gentle rhythms of her days. Together, they would mend linens for the boarding house, the simple, repetitive motion of the needle and thread a soothing balm. They would bake bread, the warmth of the kitchen and the honest smell of yeast and flour a comforting anchor in a world that still felt unsteady. Slowly, Clara began to emerge. She started by helping Mrs. Gable in the small general store that the widow ran from the front of her house. At first, she would only work in the back room, sorting buttons into wooden trays and folding bolts of calico. The sound of the bell above the door, announcing a customer, would make her flinch. But Mrs. Gable was patient. One day, she asked Clara to fetch a spool of black thread for a customer. Clara hesitated, her heart pounding, but she could not refuse the kind woman who had given her sanctuary. She slipped into the front of the store, her eyes downcast, retrieved the thread, and placed it on the counter without a word, retreating quickly to the safety of the back room. It was a small step, but it was the first of many. A week later, she found herself answering a simple question from a farmer's wife about the price of sugar. The words came out in a shy whisper, but they came. She began to see that not all faces held judgment. She saw curiosity, yes, but also a hesitant kindness. The women who had stood for her in the courthouse would now offer a small, shy smile when they saw her. They were unspoken allies in a world that was often hostile to women who carried burdens. Her confidence, a tiny, buried seed, began to be nourished by these small acts of acceptance. One afternoon, a young girl tripped on the boardwalk and dropped a jar of preserves, which shattered at Clara's feet. Without thinking, Clara knelt, murmuring words of comfort and helping the tearful girl pick up the sticky mess, her concern for the child overriding her own ingrained fear of being seen. When she stood up, she saw Mrs. Gable watching her from the doorway, a proud, warm smile on her face. And Clara, to her own profound surprise, smiled back, a genuine, unforced smile that lit up her entire face. While Clara was finding her footing in a world of domestic quiet, Eli was re-engaging with the world of men and violence he knew so well, but on different terms. Judge Blackwood, seeing the steel in the man who had risked a noose for a principal, offered him a job as a county deputy. The town needed men who could not be bought or intimidated, and the judge wagered that Eli Danner was such a man. Eli accepted. The drifter who had forsaken the law now wore a star that represented it. He was good at the work. His years on the trail had given him an eye for trouble and a quiet authority that most men respected. He was tough, disarming a pair of rowdy cowboys with a cold, level stare and a few well-chosen words, rather than with drawn pistols. But he was also fair, listening to a dispute between 2 freighters with a patience that the town's regular sheriff lacked. He gained a reputation as a man who did not speak much, but whose word was his bond, and whose presence meant that justice, in its rawest form, was being served. But the past was not so easily shed. The ghosts that had ridden with him for 5 years did not simply vanish. The nightmares still came, sudden and violent. He would find himself back in the darkened room, seeing Sarah's face, hearing the gunshot that was a permanent echo in his soul. But now, the dream would twist, and it would be Clara's face he saw, her eyes wide with terror in the dim light of the cabin. Thorne's meaty hand clamped on her wrist. He would wake with a choked cry, his heart hammering against his ribs, the sheets damp with sweat. Before, he would have woken to an empty room, the silence rushing in to confirm his utter solitude. He would have gotten up, dressed, and ridden out into the darkness, letting the cold wind scour the horror from his mind. But now, he woke to a soft touch on his arm. He would open his eyes and see Clara, sitting on the edge of his bed in the moonlight filtering through the window. Her expression filled with a deep, quiet understanding. She would not speak, but would simply place her cool hand on his forehead or pass him a cup of water. Her silent presence was an anchor, a testament that he was not in that dark place anymore, that he was here, with her, and he was safe, and he, in turn, was the living proof of her own safety. They were 2 wounded soldiers, standing watch over each other's sleep, finding in the other's presence the peace that the world had denied them. Spring came, and with it, a great thawing. The snow receded from the high country, the rivers swelled with meltwater, and the land, brown and dead for so long, began to breathe again, pushing up the first tender green shoots of new life. With the clearing of the trails came the final piece of unfinished business. One clear, cool morning, they rode out of Haven's Rest, heading east. They were going back to the cabin. Clara needed to gather the last of her mother's things, the few keepsakes she had been forced to leave behind. It was a journey into the heart of her own past, a final reckoning with the ghost of the girl she had been. The landscape was transformed. The oppressive, blinding white had been replaced by 1,000 shades of green and brown. The trail was muddy but passable, and the air was filled with the scent of damp earth and pine. It was the same land, but they were seeing it with new eyes. It was no longer a prison, but a wilderness, wild and beautiful and free. When they arrived at the clearing, a profound silence hung over the place. The cabin looked smaller, sadder, a lonely, forgotten thing. The shutter Eli had fixed was still secure, but a wild vine had begun to creep up the stone chimney. He pushed the door open, its hinges groaning in protest. A stale, musty smell hung in the air. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of sunlight that lanced through the dirty window. It was cold, colder than it had been during the storm, a deep, lifeless chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The place was a tomb, filled with the ghosts of unspoken words and unshed tears. Eli set about building a fire in the hearth, his movements deliberate, the scrape of flint and steel, the crackle of kindling catching flame, were the first new sounds the cabin had heard in months. As the fire grew, its warmth began to push back against the oppressive chill, its light chasing the darkest shadows from the corners of the room. While he worked, Clara moved through the space like a dreamer. She touched the rough, hand-carved mantelpiece. She ran her fingers over the collection of dried herbs, still hanging from the rafters, their scent now faint and dusty. She picked up the heavy Bible from the table, its leather cover cool beneath her hand. This had been her entire world, a world of fear and duty and a silent, desperate faith. She went to a small wooden chest in the corner, her mother's chest, and lifted the lid. Inside were a few precious things, a lace collar, a tintype photograph of a smiling woman with Clara's eyes, a small book of poetry. She carefully wrapped them in a cloth and placed them in her saddlebag. These were the only parts of this life she would take with her. When she was done, she stood in the center of the room. The fire was crackling now, a cheerful, living sound, The same place, the same fire, but everything was different. She was different. She picked up the oil lamp from the table, trimmed the wick, and lit it. A steady, golden glow filled the cabin, softer and more constant than the wild, dancing light of the fire. She held the lamp aloft, its light falling on Eli's face as he stood by the hearth, watching her. "This place saw me as a ghost," she said, her voice quiet but strong, resonating in the small room. "I was a shadow, doing my chores, saying my prayers, trying not to be seen. But you saw me. You made me feel real." Eli looked at her, at the woman who stood before him, bathed in the lamplight she had lit herself. She was no longer the frightened girl who had opened the door to him in the blizzard. She was a woman who had faced down her tormentor, who had spoken her truth to the world, who had found her voice and her strength. The fire he had seen in her that first day, the small, banked ember of her will to survive, was now a steady, burning flame. He walked toward her. From the pocket of his coat, he took a small, simple ring. It was not gold or silver, but a plain band of dark, forged iron he had bought from the blacksmith in town. It was as unadorned, as strong, and as honest as the man who offered it. He knelt before her, on the rough floorboards of the cabin where he had first seen her pain. He took her hand, the one that no longer bore any bruises, and held it in his own. "You are fire, Clara," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he had thought long dead. His gaze met hers, and in his eyes she saw the end of his long, lonely wandering. "And I want to be the man who stays by it." Tears welled in her eyes and began to stream down her cheeks. But these were not the silent, desperate tears of the girl who had cried by the hearth. These were the tears of a woman who had finally, completely, understood the meaning of freedom. She could not speak. She simply nodded. A slow, profound gesture of acceptance, of homecoming. He slipped the simple iron ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. Outside, the wind sighed through the pines, a wild and lonely sound that spoke of the vast, untamed hills and the endless sky. But inside the small cabin, the fire glowed warm and bright, a beacon of defiance against the encroaching twilight. And this time, when the cowboy walked in from the cold and closed the door behind him, it was not to find shelter from a storm. It was to stay. Thank you for listening to this story from the American West. Please comment with where you are listening from to connect with others who share a love for these tales. We invite you to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.